It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our Centennial kickoff, inaugurating a year-long celebration of our 100th birthday. A 100 years ago, Henry Huntington envisioned a future in which, quote, the Pacific coast will one day be the center of culture extending around the world, unquote. As I look out at you, the leaders of Southern California's and particularly LA's cultural, academic, and civic institution, Huntington's prescience is demonstrably in evidence. As the director of our botanical gardens, Jim Folsom recently reminded me, almost anything can grow in Southern California. He was right. We brought everybody here today to celebrate the extraordinary fertility and vitality of our region, both a U.S. cultural capital and, as Huntington predicted, the leading edge of the Pacific Rim. Had his visionary red car trolley system been equally as durable, many of you, especially the West Siders, would have had an easier commute. So 1919 was a very big year for the birth of LA institutions. From UCLA to the LA Philharmonic, to the iconic Musso and Frank's Grill, and Fosselman's Ice Cream, a local favorite. In celebrating our 100th, it's not all about us. It's about all of us. Because neighbors and partners have always been crucial in the life of the Huntington. As we celebrate the trust agreement in which Henry and Arabella Huntington gave their private treasures, at the time the New York Times called it the greatest private library in the world, an art collection, and expansive gardens and grounds, we also recognize we wouldn't be here were it not for George Ellery Hale, the renowned astronomer who helped develop Caltech and who was the founding director of the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena. In the Huntington's archives, we have Hale's correspondence with Huntington, which shows that from 1906 to 1916, Hale politely badgered Huntington to place his private collection in a trust, quote, for the use and benefit of the public. As significantly, though, he helped convince Huntington, the wealthy industrialist and collector, to see the value of his collection in a different way, more for the research and scholarship it would inspire than for its accumulation and display. Hale urged Henry to establish a public institution. He wrote, "There is now great need of a strong institution of broad scope, uniting all the intellectual interests of this region in a common focus." When he was later asked about the worth of his collection, Huntington replied that its value would be determined primarily by what it produces. Although these two men couldn't possibly foresee what was produced during those 100 years, it's a testament to their legacy and Arabella's that the Huntington annually attracts 1,700 visiting scholars, in addition to over 750,000 visitors from around the world. So today we take a moment to acknowledge this Southern California history, as well as to think about our future, and the ideas that will propel us all for the next 100 years. For a person turning 100, it's very natural to look back and reflect on the past. For an institution turning 100, a centennial is a moment to be like Janus, looking back and forward at the same time. So today we're celebrating how far we've come and reflect on where we want to go. We're thinking carefully about our mission and what it means to be among the oldest cultural and intellectual centers in this great region, which itself reflects the dynamic demographic evolution of our city, state, and country. We want to broaden our audiences and to focus on the Huntington's ongoing role in the cultural fabric of Southern California and beyond. The name of an institution reflects its relation to its audiences as well as its mission and ethos. In 1919, we began our journey as the Henry E. Huntington Library and Art Gallery. And over time, as you know, we became more commonly known as the Huntington Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens. Today, I am pleased to announce a change in what we are calling ourselves that reflects both the increased breadth and depth of our art collections and their public purpose. We're changing our name from Art Collections to Art Museum. You'll see this happening before your very eyes. So from today on, we will be called the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. With the word museum, we underscore our mission as a collections-based institution that not only collects art, but interprets, displays, researches, and conserves it, interacting with our varied audiences and showcasing our collection's relevance to the public. And because we want to help people know who and what we are, in this digital age, the word museum has the added advantage of making us more searchable for potential visitors of all kinds. Our Centennial launch marks the beginning of our year-long series of exhibitions, public programs, special events, and new initiatives, some of them highlighted in your printed program. As you know, the Huntington is unique for its 3 world-class collections, a delight for the experience omnivore. But our Centennial also provides a chance for us to bring these collections into greater dialogue with each other, imagining all the cross-pollination that's possible through collaboration, big thinking, and multidisciplinary approaches. Our upcoming exhibition, 1919, is an example of our curators, Jenny Watts and James Glisson, working with all 3 of our collections to shed light on the local and global context of that one tumultuous year when the Huntington was founded. But to get where we are today, it's taken the contributions of so many people, including many in the audience, and far too many to mention. I do want to single out 3 couples who are making our year-long celebration possible through their very generous support. Avery and Andy Barth, Terry and Jerry Cole, and Lisa and Tim Sloan. We're enormously grateful for your support. And there are 2 exceptional leaders of the Huntington who moved this institution from where it was 30 years ago to where it is today. The first, Bob Schottheim, whom many of you know personally, regrets that he couldn't join us for this joyous celebration. During my first year at the Huntington, he has provided valuable advice in beautiful handwritten letters. Recently, Bob, who impressively involved community members in the life of the Huntington during his presidency, reminded me of the way the institution's scholarly perspective has enabled successive generations of scholars, staff, and board members to support the necessary evolution of the Huntington's mission from its Gilded Age origins. Research directors Roy Ritchie and Steve Hindle, more recently, have been crucial in keeping the research perspective at the forefront. The other leader who's made immense contributions to the Huntington is Steve Koblick, who's here with us today. Where is Steve? There he is. Steve led this institution for a decade and a half, truly transforming it financially, expanding its programming, its spaces, as well as its public role and responsibility. Thank you, Steve, for everything you did to set the stage for this moment. As we look forward, our commitment to our public mission has never been stronger. And to strengthen that mission, we intend to expand and extend our collaborations and partnerships. Many of you who are here today represent our partners past and present. UCLA, Caltech, USC, the Getty, LA cultural organizations such as the Vincent Price Museum and Clock Shop, as well as schools within the LAUSD system who come to the Huntington for special classes in the library, the galleries, and the gardens. In the first 5 to 10 years of the next 100, we're especially dedicated to increasing access, diversity, and collaboration. Partnerships link institutions, but also audiences and parts of our city. So in that collaborative spirit, I'd like to invite Anne Philbin to the stage. As you know, she's the dynamic and visionary director of UCLA's Hammer Museum. Annie?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karen. From one institution celebrating its centennial to another, congratulations. It's incredible to think how far Los Angeles has come in 100 years. It's now known as the creative capital of the world, the #1 producer of worldwide visual culture, and a red-hot center internationally of contemporary art. With every passing year, more and more artists are claiming Los Angeles as their home. Whether they lived here their entire lives, came here to celebrate, to attend one of the many illustrious university art programs, or relocated to Southern California as established artists. Since 2012, the Hammer has recognized this flourishing community of artists through our biennial Made in LA. For each rendition, we have tasked a pair of curators to seek out artists working in various media at various stages in their careers to highlight what has become an internationally acclaimed survey of art being made in this city. As we've already announced, Miriam Ben-Salah and Lauren Mackler are our curators for our next Made in LA 2020. So why am I up here talking about a Hammer project? It is my great honor to announce that next year's edition of Made in LA 2020 will extend across the region to be presented both at the Hammer and at the Huntington. Yeah. Very exciting. I'm also pleased to announce that Bank of America has generously come on board as presenting sponsor for Made in LA 2020. This is a wonderful opportunity to bridge the east and west sides of Los Angeles and to make this biennial accessible to an even wider audience. The Hammer, as you know, is free to visit all year round. For Made in LA 2020, visitors to the Hammer will be offered passes to the Huntington so they can see the entirety of Made in LA free of charge, also thanks to Bank of America. It's really great. We could not be more excited about this collaboration with this extraordinary institution. Made in LA is always a major event for Los Angeles, but I think this partnership with Karen and her team and the Huntington will give us even more cause for celebration. So thank you so much.
We are so excited, our whole team at the Huntington is so excited about this collaboration and the chance to be involved with this internationally significant exhibition. So it will be great. And now you will hear from our 3 collection directors about the future and how the Huntington's collections will contribute to their fields in the next century. First, Sandra Brooke, who expertly oversees the 11 million items in our library collection. Then Christina Nielsen, who recently joined the Huntington and has already invigorated our art museum. And Jim Folsom, who for 35 years has provided transformative leadership in our astonishing botanical gardens. And now I give you Future Perfect.
Good morning. It's grand to see you all here. So, how does the library think about time and the next 100-year horizon? A century is a puzzle in the library context. It's a very long stretch when compared to our individual lifetimes, yet it is laughably short in the span of recorded human history, and the latter is a library's territory. So how did the Huntington forecast its own first century? In 1925, Henry Huntington endorsed a vision for a repository of books and manuscripts of the greatest rarity and value, focused on tracing the progress of our English-speaking peoples. So from the vantage point of 2019, there's a quaint optimism to this notion of progress, and what we would see as a misplaced conviction in a preeminent Anglo-American narrative. But don't call it cynicism. Today, we simply can't see the human experiment as anything other than deeply complex. Since then, the Huntington's collections have grown and persisted and informed broader and more nuanced worldviews than could have been imagined a century ago, from postmodern skepticism to pragmatic idealism and a multivalent worldview. Researchers, abetted by librarians, are a powerful force. When they're on the case, collections simply can't be kept on a shelf or in a box. Indeed, researchers and their questions are an ever-rolling stream, but libraries still have in view a kind of fixity, of fixing things in time. For special collections libraries, all 3 dimensions of time are always and ever palpably present. On any given day, multiple pasts bubble to the surface and make themselves known. An explorer's map, a medieval prayer book, a sci-fi manuscript, or a housemaid's diary, all stand ready to witness and speak to one another across time. Someone once said, history isn't what we know, it's the little bit we're able to remember. And manuscripts, publications, images, and ephemera are some of the principal sources of humankind's memories. Our obligation as a library is to all 3 dimensions of time. Librarians are guardians and champions of the past, collectors of history's documentary accumulation, from the grand to the quotidian, the laudable to the execrable, the antique to yesterday's email. Libraries must anticipate tomorrow and try to imagine what future researchers and viewers might want or need to know. We trust that tomorrow's minds will have questions, insights, and ways of interrogating documentary history that we have never imagined. So how should the library act today in anticipation of the next 100-year horizon? Well, we must think judiciously and imaginatively in choosing what to preserve, and be fearless in seeking diverse and provocative voices. Libraries must batten the hatches and build lifeboats to protect collections through the vicissitudes that are sure to come. natural disasters, social and economic upheavals, censorship, ignorance, and willful misapprehension. We also want to seize this moment and help our collections speak to current generations, because cultivating a love and respect for documentary history is the surest road to its survival, and perhaps our own. As the voices and visions in our libraries are made manifest, we should prepare to be astonished with where collections-based encounters, analysis, and serendipity will lead. So in the spirit of stepping out with optimism into our second century, the library has made a small acquisition that won't hit our shelves until just 4 years shy of the Huntington's bicentennial. Until then, the library's purchase will be growing in a Norwegian wood. Artist Katie Patterson's future library is a 100-year literary artwork and an act of indefatigable optimism. 5 years ago, Patterson planted a forest of 1,000 spruce trees in Norway. This forest will be held in trust until the year 2114, when the trees will be harvested, turned into paper, and provide the stock for the publication of 100 texts, until then held secret by 100 writers, the first being Margaret Atwood. This little acquisition is a vote of confidence in the future of the environment, of art, of books, and the written word, and the future of libraries. Yes, we are confident our librarian successors will not fail to claim the Huntington's copy of this long-awaited anthology. But between now and 2114, we are equally confident that millions of other texts, images, and objects, undiscovered and as yet uncreated, will cross the Huntington's threshold to join this great past, present, and future library. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Christina Nielsen, and for the last 10 minutes, I've been the director of the Art Museum here at the Huntington. It has a nice ring to it, and thank you, Karen, for your support. Now that we're a museum, I'd like to spend the next few minutes considering what that term means, what it meant to Arabella and Henry, what it means today, and what it will likely mean in the future. Henry Huntington, entrepreneur and futurist, a proponent of new technologies. Arabella Huntington, perhaps the greatest Gilded Age collector you've never heard of. Together, they stand out with the likes of their peers, such as Walters, Morgans, Fricks, and Gardners, by bringing together objects from the past to actively shape a future. They founded the first Old Master collection in Los Angeles, which included Asian ceramics, Italian Renaissance bronzes, French decorative arts, and British grand manner portraits from the 18th century. With this expansive time, they allowed for connections across time and place, and they put their historic works in conversation with art from their day by placing sculpture on the grounds from artists of their time, including their daughter-in-law, Anna Hyatt Huntington. They also gave us a framework for considering how to move forward, encouraging us to continue making connections across time and place, to invest in new technologies, and to share the collection with the public. So now, the present moment, and I would suggest that in many ways, the future is now and the future is here. The definition of a museum is quickly changing, as is the nature of our work. The International Council of Museums, or ICOM, just released a new definition of museums as a, quote, democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic space for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures, end quote. Our historic collection is indeed a treasure trove to be mined for thinking about making connections across time and place, how trade and exchange shaped objects and shaped lives and shaped intellectual pursuits. But which stories do we choose to tell, and who tells them? Recent partnerships here at the Huntington, such as one with the Vincent Price Art Museum, allowed Carolina Caicedo, one of the great artists in the LA area, to produce a new work of art, Apariciones, Apparitions, now on view in the Huntington Art Gallery. Please check it out if you have time today, which inserts back into the history of our founding narrative people and labor who've been lost over time. More specifically, Blue Boy, our most iconic work, has continued to inspire over time artists much more recent than when he arrived in 1921. A young Robert Rauschenberg recalled that on leave from military duty in San Diego, he came to the Huntington and had an epiphany in front of Blue Boy. So did a young teenage Kehinde Wiley, who would come on visits to the Huntington on Saturday. And so we're thinking very deeply about how to unlock more epiphanies for more people in our galleries and through expanded online resources. How do we share our collections beyond our walls? How do we reach other young Roberts and young Kehindes from South Los Angeles, from San Diego, and from places really far away like Santa Monica, or Kansas City, or Kosovo, or Kyoto, or anywhere else? So in the context of the Huntington itself, what does our art collection mean? This is a multidisciplinary institution, and as the definition of art keeps changing and evolving, and moving faster and faster towards the performative, time-based, phenomenological, embodied experiences, I was reminded recently by Jim Folsom, who's coming up next, that the Huntington itself is the original conceptual work of art. You've felt it, you've had experiences in the gardens, and then come into our art collections. And we will be looking to the creative people in our midst to help us unlock even further the multidisciplinary resources that we have. And that brings me to Los Angeles. What about the context for the Huntington's Art Museum here in LA? You've heard from Annie Philbin already that this is the hotbed of the artistic world, and we are so pleased to be working with Hammer on Made in LA, exemplifying what an extraordinary moment this is for our region. But if we follow the Huntington route and take a longer arc of history, I might suggest that Made in LA 2020 has a really important antecedent, and that could be considered Made in London 1770. Because going back to Gainsborough and his fabulous Blue Boy painting, what we've recently learned, as Christina O'Connell, our senior paintings conservator, has worked on it over the past year, is that in fact, Gainsborough, hundreds of years ago, just as the artist in our midst today, was absolutely pushing the envelope of what it meant to be a painter and what the medium could provide. And so I would say it makes absolute sense for us at the Huntington to be working with the Hammer and offering up our resources for artists, writers, performers, dancers, thinkers in our midst. The past is not dead. In fact, as Faulkner said, it isn't even past. It's alive and waiting to be unlocked in the objects in our collection. I can't begin to predict now how successors of ours 100 years from now will do that, any more than Henry and Arabella could have predicted iPhones or rockets to the moon. But they believed in technology, they believed in sharing the collection with the public, and they believed in connections across time and space. I feel if we hold true to those principles, we'll be just fine over the course of the next 100 years. And in closing, I offer another definition for our museum, that it should be not just a repository of things, but a collection of ideas and a place for sharing them with others. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Jim Folsom, and I guess I'm the old-timer here. So what are we up to in the gardens? Well, the garden staff is planting trees also. We planted several hundred last year and intend to plant more this year. We do this because there's occasional loss. Santa Ana in 2011 felled 700 trees in one evening. We plant because new opportunities arise, wonderful new trees become available. We plant trees because they provide structure for the landscape, structure that takes years to develop because trees take time. We plant trees because last year on 6th July, The gardens experienced a record high temperature of 118 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving vegetation scorched throughout the landscape. The world is changing. The gardens need shade. We plant trees because that is what gardeners do. Observe, think, plant, cultivate, take our losses, lick our wounds, plan for change, investing energy and resources to create something that will be of worth for future generations. So what is that future? How far is that horizon? For a lawn at the Rose Bowl, it may be a single football game. For carrots, it's 3 months. For trees, we look further into the future, 80 to 100 years, easily through the end of the century. But in all of our actions, even short-term plantings, we should build soil and capacity. Every act can be viewed as an investment. Through immersive experience in programming, gardens also plant ideas and inspiration, the beauty and power of life unfolding, the importance of cycles, the value and glorious smell of fresh water and arable soil, the thriftiness of nature as a model of sustainability, the burden of waste, the payoff of planting and patience, the value and benefits of pure physical toil, the relationship between human effort and yield, the march of time and seasons, the sanctity of place, the importance of plants as the givers of life and the basis of biodiversity and respect for life. Those lessons remind us human interactions are a form of cultivation. Even short timelines build audiences, help build communities, and expand their horizons. So we do not look at the end of the Centennial in 2020, but to 2050, when children born today will be into their careers, will have young families, even further to the dawn of the 22nd century, when today's young children should be active octogenarians, bringing their families to the Japanese and Chinese gardens for cultural experience. As we enter that distant future, how perfect will it be? Will the world's climate reverse its ruinous pace of change? How much of our rich inheritance of biodiversity remains somehow intact? Will people individually have greater knowledge, skills, and empowerment? Will things be better? Will the world be more equitable and sustainable? Will we learn to live together, cherish each other, and share precious resources with humans and with other life forms? Humans have wrested control and taken lead of life on planet Earth. Malthus, whose predictions sit quietly on the shelves in the Rare Book Library, focused on human population, but his prophecies amplify when we visit the Virginia Steele Scott Gallery and view Church's Chimborazo floating calmly on a south wall. Projecting the majestic nature of the Andes above bucolic coastal life, Church's terrain reminds us that as Malthus was predicting simple human calamity, Alexander von Humboldt was inventing ecology as a study and concern which brought environmental degradation to the calculation. Today, the story is stark, or more prosaically, as the signs in tourist tchotchke shops say, you break it, you bought it. What have we broken? What have we bought? We have irrevocably broken a system that evolved over hundreds of millions of years. You may reply, but we're part of nature. That's true. But nature has grim ways of dealing with upstarts like us. To avoid that fate, we must learn to manage the earth using nature. How do we do that? To me, gardening is the work ahead, and the lessons are crucial. In the perfect future, I imagine these Huntington gardens and the act of gardening will have helped to form a better world. We can have protected, valuable, and even seemingly insignificant species from extinction. We will have bolstered science literacy through exciting people about what plants are up to, and have created seamless appreciation of arts and sciences, history and culture. We will have improved our own efforts in sustainability as the basis for encouraging others to reduce waste and steward communities. Fortunately, the structure we need for those kinds of lessons exists. The Huntington has living collections, displays, beautiful facilities, and staff who are well competent to relate science, sustainable horticulture, productive urban agriculture, and cultural arts. And I wish to mention we also have volunteers who are dedicated to this. And the institution exists in a large and diverse community where we can collaborate at many levels to model and mature programs and lessons of value to yet larger audiences. Practices that must be in place if the world holds greater promise at the Huntington's second centennial than we see before us today. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. How is everybody? Well, we gather for amazing individuals today to talk about the future of LA, and it was really a fascinating process for me. Each one of them comes from a different discipline. Do you want me to tell you a little bit of who they are, or is yeah? Okay. So Melody Yashar is a design architect, researcher, and co-founder of a space exploration architecture, Search Plus, a group building upon a 10-year portfolio of academic space research and practice developing human supporting concepts for space exploration. How about that? Victoria Orphan is a Pisces. She wanted me to let you guys know that. She is a professor in the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences at the California Institute of Technology. She's a geobiologist studying the interactions between marine microorganisms and the environment. She is a 2016 MacArthur Genius recipient. Yuval Sharon is a theater and opera director who has been creating, and have you seen his work? Anybody? You know, and a cool thing about Yuval is that Mark Swade just wrote this amazing article defining the work that Yuval and Peter Sellers are doing as the LA Opera School. I don't know if you saw that, but that was a great nod to him. Anyway, he's also a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, the same year as Victoria. And I think you're going to have another MacArthur Genius Grant afterwards, right? Are there any other MacArthur Genius Grants in the room? That's what I said. There's another one coming after us, another Genius recipient. Anyway, and Lloyd Shore, you must have heard about him. You know, born in Seoul, Korea, raised in LA. 2010, Food and Wine named him Best New Chef. He has a cookbook and a memoir called LA Sun. He was included in the 2016 Time 100 Most Influential People in the World. Should I continue? And I'm proud to say I just finished a TV show with Roy called Broken Bread. I hope everybody has seen it. Anyway, so it was fascinating to talk to the four of them and figure out how to create a sort of a path to connect all of them, but I'm going to do my best. So 100 years ago, 1919, and you guys had just heard that, a lot of institutions here in LA were created, and there was one man that went up into Mount Wilson, Edwin Hubble, and he looked up at the sky and took a bunch of photographs, and he discovered that we were not the center of the universe. And that sort of propelled 100 years of innovation in the aerospace industry, in technology, in sciences, and we ended up going to the moon, right? Now we're not trying to figure out if we're the center of the Earth, but sort of trying to figure out what is our role here on the Earth in the context of everything else that is going on around us. And you know, Melody, who I already explained to you guys that she's a design architect and doing all these amazing things, she was awarded the top prize in 2015 for the NASA Centennial Challenge for a 3D printed habitat, Mars ice house, right?
That's right.
What, can you explain what that is and what, I mean, that was 10 years ago and that set in motion an incredible sort of line of work.
Well, okay, sure. Thank you for the introduction, first of all. Mars Ice House was a project that my team, which was then a very informal collection of graduate students, put together for a submission to NASA Centennial challenges. NASA has been interested in 3D printed habitats for a long time because it represents a sustainable way of creating an initial human settlement on another planet, be it the moon or Mars, without having to launch and ship all of the materials from Earth directly, which is prohibitively expensive. So they're interested in using the local and indigenous materials of the planet itself in order to autonomously create a habitat which would be for a crew of 4 astronauts approximately for 1 year. So what we did as a team is we came together and assembled a team of subject matter experts and consultants ranging from planetary geology to astrophysics to human factors, a whole bunch of other disciplines. And we put together this proposal, which was called Mars Ice House, and it won unanimously among the judges. It won first place over the European Space Agency as well as Foster and Partners. And we received a whole bunch of attention from that. We received phone calls from aerospace companies after that point asking us to consult, and our work sort of evolved ever since.
How is all the work that you and your team are doing thinking about designing habitats in other parts, extraterrestrial, like in Mars and in the moon? How is all that knowledge being transferred here on Earth?
Right, so there's really nothing like designing a habitat for living extraterrestrially to reflect back and have us have us consider or think about what are the fundamental elements of what we need to survive and to live in a very hostile and foreign environment. That's not to create a parallel with Earth, but it forces you to think about what do we need? How do we create a sustainable life when you are in this hostile and foreign environment? And the most fundamental elements essentially become oxygen, shelter, food, and water. And so the proposal put together those 4 elements and created a sustainable strategy to not only mine for water ice underneath the surface of the regolith on Mars, but to use that water ice as a building construction material, which the astronauts could eventually also use to drink and to sustain themselves. And that became the foundational principle for what we were doing. So we're using design for outer space, we're using space habitat design as a way of considering how we can think about how we actually sustain our own resources here on Earth sustainably, and how we create and how we can change the way that we're looking at building construction technology here on Earth.
Which is, I mean, all the innovations that happened in the last 100 years in aerospace, technology, telecommunications, I mean, we're living it today with our cell phones, with everything that we have. Can you project what you're working on? How would it affect us here?
Yeah, so one of the byproducts of the work that we've done in the 3D printed habitat competition is that we've been looking at new ways to do materials engineering, but also to sustainably create housing in the near term here on Earth for low-income populations, particularly the Sioux tribes in South Dakota. So what we're doing is we're doing some initial materials prototyping and technology demonstrations to show how we can create and scale housing prototypes for these communities here on Earth in the near term.
And from our conversations, you mentioned that we could potentially see a complete transformation in materials, how we design, and maybe in 15 to 100 years, we would not even be looking at concrete as a element and material for construction and habitat, right?
Yeah, the way that we're thinking about concrete is changing. We're trying to determine what types of alternatives we can use to aggregates that are going to be more sustainable, that are going to be reusable, recyclable. And we're hoping that implementing these new ideas when it comes to 3D printing, when it comes to new ideas of building information modeling, is going to help us transform the inefficiencies in the construction industry today.
So, I mean, the work that you're doing, thinking about habitat in other parts besides the Earth, is basically helping us look inward for solutions to
That's
a certain degree, right?
That's right.
There was, 50 years ago, and we just went through the 50th anniversary, I think, of the landing on the moon, and it was the first time that we saw an image of the Earth. And that was mind-blowing for a lot of people, and in some sense, began the environmental movement, right? And I want to bring, the work that Victoria is doing, because you're looking at the Earth in a very particular way. You're going really deep, right? You consider yourself a detective of the smallest life forms that are making the planet livable for us. What do you mean exactly?
That's right. Yeah, so I was very pleased to be invited to this and thinking ahead for the next 100 years to be a champion for microorganisms. That's bacteria and archaea. They're probably the most important life forms you've never seen, but hopefully at the end of this you'll walk away with a greater appreciation. So these microorganisms have basically shaped the planet and made it livable for us over the course of many billions of years. And when we think to the future, you talked about these essential elements that are needed to think about colonizing other planets. I would put microorganisms as one of those essential elements that are required, not only in terms of their ability to transform chemicals and create a habitable environment, but even the microorganisms that are living within us that we know are really essential. So how do we sustain that when we're off the planet? These are really fascinating things to think about going ahead.
And particularly, I don't know the name of that microorganism, but you particularly found this microorganism at the depth of the ocean that is doing something incredible for us.
Yeah. So my love is looking in the ocean, and it turns out that microorganisms that live in ocean environments are really critical for habitability on the planet. So about half of the oxygen that we breathe come from microorganisms that are using sunlight in the ocean, just like a tree is producing oxygen and fixing carbon dioxide. But also we have microorganisms that live in the deep ocean that are colonizing places where methane is coming out of the seafloor. And this methane is a potent greenhouse gas, so if it gets in the atmosphere, it's kind of bad news. These microorganisms are like the gatekeeper, and they're oxidizing that methane in the environment. And so the big passion that we have had is to go into these environments using submarines, collect these microscopic organisms and try to figure out how they're actually making a living growing on methane in the deep sea. And so we've been able to use technologies, advances in gene sequencing, geochemical tools, bring them together to really understand how organisms influence this really unique and remote habitat.
Wow. So, with all the climate shifts that we're having right now, how do you harness the power of these microorganisms to help us adapt to all these sort of climate shifts that we're having.
Yeah. So microorganisms definitely need to be part of the conversation when we think about predictions of how climate might shift in the future. Certainly projecting ahead in 100 years, microorganisms are going to be the centerpiece of sustainability for the planet. And there's a lot that we don't understand about microorganisms that are influencing and adapting to changing environments, be it the Arctic or the deep ocean, or even in the Huntington gardens and the soils around us, that people who are doing the kind of research that I do are really feeling the time crunch and trying to understand how do we pick apart what are the salient elements that make these organisms tick. We can use this maybe to help manipulate these types of organisms going forward, but also just trying to create better models for understanding how things are going to change going forward. So it's a really it's exciting line of research to be involved in, and also incredibly important, I think.
I want to go back to the word that you used, manipulate. So the idea would be to manipulate these microorganisms so that we can harness them even more, right? But I mean, at what point it is too much, right?
Yeah.
And at what point something else needs to happen when we're trying to mitigate this sort of climate chaos that we're in?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this in the back room too. I think so. There's amazing feats that have happened in a field called synthetic biology, where people are basically using microorganisms as the workhorse. They can make all sorts of novel chemistries, and people are starting to look at how do you put different microorganisms together to create these emergent properties that one organism can't do on its own. But there really are fundamental things that we don't understand about ecosystems, and I think are really hard to manufacture in the lab, that we just really need to go back into the environment and understand and realize that these organisms have had billions of years to evolve these communities in a way that it's going to be very hard for us in our short time on Earth to sort of reproduce in a very simplistic way. And so just having respect for how this network of organisms is sustaining life, I think is important when we think about future of humanity on the planet.
And we talked a little bit about the relationship with these microorganisms and the future of food and growing populations and hunger.
Right. Yeah, so definitely, populations are growing, and we have to think about how are we going to sustain nutrition for growing populations, and
sustainably too.
In a sustainable way, and we're already starting to see exciting developments. So companies are trying to do smart farming to try to not over saturate the land with fertilizer, but try to add just enough, right? So we don't get these imbalances in nutrient cycles. We talked about something that you all might be familiar with, the Impossible Burger, right? So there's this big movement now with plant-sustained foods, and how did these people make this impossibly juicy red burger? Well, that red is coming from a symbiosis of a microorganism and a plant, something called leg hemoglobin, just like the hemoglobin in our bodies. So this leg hemoglobin brings oxygen to bacteria in plants that fix nitrogen. They've been able to take that leg hemoglobin and express it in a microorganism, in a yeast in the lab, and they're able to create this amazing food source that mimics beef. And of course, being able to come up with alternatives for protein on the planet is really, I think, one of the big issues going forward in terms of sustainability.
We actually, on the show that we did with Roy Broken Bread, one of the episodes looks at the future of food, and we ended up visiting the lab, right?
Not of Impossible, but of Beyond Burger.
Beyond Burger.
Beyond Meat.
Which has similar principles, and it sort of instigates everything that you're talking about. But the interesting thing, and just pivoting to Roy, food is not only about hunger and sustainability and the environment. Food is also about culture, right? And it's also about people. And I want to bring up 1992. In 1992, the beginning of the 90s here in LA and in California were really traumatic. We had an uprising in 1992. Then in 1994, we voted for Proposition 187, which in essence sort of took away the possibility of undocumented immigrants to have access to education and public health. And as tumultuous as that time was, it was also a time of organizing, and it was a time of reconciliation. And I really think that's the context where you sort of were born out of, right? And I'm curious to see and to understand and share with them, how did those events inform the food revolution that you created 10 years later?
First of all, RIP to Rodney King, which set everything off. I don't know, I guess for me personally, I have to look at the way that I grew up. I grew up as a latchkey kid in the city since I was about 4 or 5 years old. So I've always had a bit of a double life, and kind of the words that Rodney said of, can we all just get along, have always rung true to me, and I've always been a very quiet person that has been in the center of situations, but also had the ability, like in the Twilight Zone, to be an invisible man, because I was a kid walking around the streets of LA for many, many years, and I was able to see situations with nobody seeing me. And so I think over the years I digested, and all of those things imprinted upon me, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. And it took a long time for those things to manifest and form, but those things influenced everything that I saw in the city, the streets, the neighborhoods, the alleyways, the corners, the blocks, the different neighborhoods. All of those things informed how I wanted this world to be, because I always had this very idealistic point of view on life that I couldn't understand as a young child, or even as a grown adult, why we continue to fight with each other, and why there's abundance here and there's lack of resources here. I couldn't process that information, but finally, when I had a forum to express it through cooking, is when I was able to pull those things together. So I think it's from my childhood, as I look at it.
Let's try to break that a little more. Like, you brought it all together in the food.
Yeah.
And, early on, there were two things that happened. The kind of food that you cooked, and how you delivered it to people, right? Those are two key things, I think, in that.
Yeah.
narrative.
Well, what happened to me in 2008 was a very unique phenomenon. It was, I guess, in terms of being in this intellectual astrological space, it was a universe that exploded, and I was in a moment where the whole world felt like it was crashing down, and the economy was crashing. We were lied to by our banks and our government, and everyone was in a state of shock and limbo. And then we came along a little bit like Cheech and Chong, in this beat-up bus, and just started feeding the streets. And we gave some hope. But what that really became is it became a prism into all of the things that we don't acknowledge sometimes as society and as humans. The voices that we don't hear, the voices that we don't let inside, to let participate, the cultures that we don't let participate. I was thinking about what you said about Hubble, and thinking about Rodney King and racism and ignorance, and just as we as humans thought we were the center of the universe, to beat a man like Rodney, or even many humans today, that happens on the streets that doesn't get documented or video, comes from ignorance, comes from this this inability to understand or allow other voices to enter into the arena. And so when I think of a place like the Huntington or marking as a Centennial, what I try to do with our food is provide an imprint into so what I'm trying to say is that we consider all of these things as a society as intellectual, whether it's science or music, art. You know, we value these things, but we don't value other cultures or life. And we don't allow these things to contribute to what is being preserved or what is determining the future. And so what we try to do with food and through the movement of Kogi and through the movement of broken bread is we try to provide that voice and add it to hopefully the next 100 years. That I hope that in the 200-year anniversary that we're sitting here and we're not in the same situation that we are in now, where the voices that are excluded are being beaten and living in conditions that none of us would accept, you know. And that's only because we don't add value to the things that we don't appreciate. I don't know how to say it. We don't add value to the things that we think don't mean anything or that
I mean, you had a great line, and we'll pivot to Yuval, but you had a great line in our series saying, you know, we add value to rare ingredients. We do not add value to rare people.
And that's exactly, and very similar to what we're talking about here, is that we add value to all of these disciplines, you know. And I'm not just talking about here as a museum, but I'm talking about all of us as humans. We add value to these disciplines and these sciences, which are important. But what about the science of the streets? What about the science of hunger, the science of culture? And so what we try to do with the show Broken Bread is just offer some intellectualism that can be an ingredient into the future, that these things matter. Because we can't go the next 100 years where voices are continued to be silenced. Because then again, we're just gonna, those that do have power and those that do have position will continue to think that you're the center of the universe.
Which, you know, leads me, I mean, we did Broken Bread, and in a way, we're sort of using storytelling as a tool for social transformation, you know. And Yuval, you have been basically using narrative as a way to make us audience reflect, make us audience self-aware, make us look into the future. Can you break that a little bit, what you have done with Invisible Cities and Hopscotch, and then we can tell them about the new work that you're doing in the context of narrative change and future change?
Yeah, I think to pick up on what Roy said, which I thought was so beautiful, which is, can you prize the discipline and the human, I guess, you know, like why would we put one over the other? And what I think I love most about opera is it's a discipline that turns us back into ourselves somehow. It's an opportunity. It's actually in many ways kind of a machine of self-reflection in so many ways. And that's something that is actually, might seem antithetical to maybe what we think about when we think about opera. I think we have a lot of assumptions of what opera can be. But opera began as an imagination of what Greek theater was. And Greek theater was from what we think, Greek theater was, the opportunity for an entire populace to come together and to reflect on the values that they wanted to perpetuate. And that is something that is both a collective act, because we all sit in a theater together, and it's a highly individual act as we identify with the players on the stage. And so we get an opportunity to think about our own lives as a microcosm within the larger macrocosm of our society. And I think that is where theater, and particularly opera, has a lot of power. And it's a power that is not often embraced as soon as opera became institutionalized. But at the core of what opera is the meeting place of different artists and the meeting place of different disciplines, so that we can expand our consciousness.
So let's talk about how Sweetland, which is your new production, opening in February, March next year.
Yeah.
How is Sweetland addressing this? Because from our conversation, is one of the hardest, most controversial pieces that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I'll mention this also in the context of narrative, because I think we're all talking a little bit about how we're telling stories to make sure that we all hope there will be a 200th bicentennial for the Huntington, for all these institutions that we cherish. But for that to happen, we're going to need to really disrupt a lot of the narratives. I think all of us agree to that in our different ways. What stories are we telling ourselves? What stories about ourselves are we perpetuating? And in that way, what lies continue to perpetuate into the future that we all have an opportunity to really change and disrupt? And that's where I think, again, theater and opera has a great potential, because it's a space for us to imagine a different future. And when we tell ourselves a different story, and we start to change who tells the story, what's the content of the story, and how do we experience that story, then we're entering a space where we can imagine another future. And that's, in many ways, what we've been thinking about as we've been thinking about this project called Sweetland, which is a kind of reimagination of American history, or a reckoning with American history, the way we've been taught it, and an opportunity to reframe it from different points of view. It's going to take place at the LA State Historic Park in March, which is in many ways kind of the birthplace of LA. And I won't go into all those many layers, but just to say that that seems like that's a site that has a power and a potentiality and a history that offers us an amazing platform for reframing our own sense of identity, and how important that is to really think about our national identity in a time of crisis, and how opera could be part of the conversation to shift that.
I know I've been told to stop now, but it says time is up. But there's one thing that it really became a common denominator between all of us, and all of you, to a certain degree, brought up this idea of creating, or the need to create, a new belief system, which is part of this narrative that you're talking about. And Victoria, you brought this up. Melody, you brought this up. Is we not only need to do the work, we need to create a new framework, a new belief system. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, briefly.
Briefly.
I think that this is a good opportunity to bring people together from very different walks of life to share, I think, from my perspective, the fundamentals of science, and to actually, for science, it's not a belief system, really. I mean, we start from the facts and go forward, but sometimes there's a disconnect from what we're talking. We sort of talk in this bubble amongst scientists, and we lose the opportunity to be able to share our research and our passions with the general community. And I think, especially around issues of climate right now, there's an incredible urgency for people who are working in this space to be able to share the importance, and to get people on board to think about how they can make a contribution in a special way, and at least change their thinking about how we go forward into the next 100 years.
Melody, last word?
Science, absolutely. And I think that science is, and a discourse around science and what's possible is going to be critical for how we imagine and reinvent what the future will bring. But there's also, in my work in particular, an emphasis on human factors. How do you design for people? What do you provide that's human-centric in engineering to actually respond to the needs of people in outer space, but people generally? A lot of the backlash in the recent 50th anniversary for the Apollo landing, sort of asked, well, why did we send 3 men to the moon, and why are we sort of regretting the fact that there hasn't been much in the way of technology development to get us to the moon again, has been, well, think about all the problems we have here on Earth when it comes to hunger, when it comes to misrepresenting populations and demographics of people who are not free white males. So, yeah.
Anyway, thank you. And I want to introduce you to another MacArthur Genius recipient, Josh Koon. So now you guys call him.
Thank you, Juan. Hi, everybody. How's it been? Good? It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. We've reached the end of the program, and we're going to end in what I hope you find to be an incredibly powerful and beautiful way. And to get us there, please join me in welcoming Dexter's Story, featuring Ramona Gonzalez and Miguel Atwood Ferguson. Thank you, Miguel, Ramona, Dexter. You want to grab your mic and come on over, Dexter? Quick chat.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Dexter. So tell us a little bit about what we just heard. There he is.
There he is. We just performed a composition by this man, Harold Bruce Forsyth. He is an African-American composer from the 1920s, born in 1908 and died in 1976. He wrote a lot of music in his early years and started getting deaf. Actually got a scholarship to Juilliard. Became deaf and came back home from Juilliard, back to Los Angeles, and still composed, continued to compose even with deafness. And that was a piece he wrote. He actually fell in love with poets and literary works, and he wrote compositions to James Joyce, Arne Bontemps of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as Li Po, an 8th century Chinese poet. And that was a piece by Li Poet, a poem by Li Po from the 8th century called Flute of Marvel. And my great musician accompanist, Miguel and Ramona, took it on with me. We haven't heard this music. This is music that we actually pulled from the archives and brought to life.
And this is a piece you've never heard or seen until we actually were led into the archives here at the Huntington. Carla Nielsen, if she's in the house, who introduced us to this collection.
That's right.
And it's full of scores. You can see some examples here behind us of Forsyth scores. And what was that process like for you? I mean, you're an LA guy, you're from Los Angeles, and you've grown up with the history most broadly of music and culture in Los Angeles, but also specifically of the long, deep tradition of African American music in LA. What was it like for you to go into the archives here at the Huntington and to interact with these pieces?
I have to take a deep breath on that one. Josh and I actually went into the archives together. We waited for the manuscripts to come. And once they were ready for us, we went into a little room and opened them up. And I just had a sense of wonder and fantasy, like I was opening up a world. You know, I'm a black kid from Los Angeles. I was born and raised pretty much in the same area that Forsyth was. And what an honor it was to actually see these manuscripts, to see his penmanship, to see his compositions, his own writing. What an honor.
I remember one of the most visceral reactions you had was the sense of wonder at seeing the kind of poets who you've already mentioned, the way he wanted to engage musically with poets from all these different traditions and backgrounds in creating a music that, and we were talking before backstage about how difficult to categorize this music is, that it doesn't fit traditional paradigms of jazz and blues on Central Avenue, and it also doesn't fit traditional paradigms of European art music.
Right. Yeah, we think of the Harlem Renaissance during the 20s. Well, that ended after the Great Depression, and then there was an LA Renaissance. And a lot of musicians, I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers. I think 30% of the professionals, the black professionals, were musicians. So being a musician was a big deal. You know, and Ramona was talking about that, how people would call this music art music. I mean, we've looked at a few literary pieces about Forsyth, and they call it art music. But Ramona was saying this very eloquently, in that, you know, it really can't be put in a box. It's, you know, he was drawing from so many influences. He had been at Juilliard from 1927 to 28. So he was around the Harlem Renaissance writers. And so he probably pulled those influences into his music. He was also into classical music. He had been trained, the Wilkins School we talked about. He was trained here. He was actually, one of his professors was a former USC head of music. So he had all these influences and he put them all in his music. So it's hard to categorize what he was doing.
And as a contemporary musician, when once you get over the awe or you engage with the, with the wonder of the original pieces, and then the task for us was not just to bring these pieces to life in a literal way, though that I suppose was an option, but we really wanted to try to figure out how to think about Forsyth from both an archival, but also in a kind of, in a way, almost like a remixed aesthetic, like how to reinterpret his music through a contemporary ear. What was that process like for you? And then individually, like what was literally the process you went through? And then how did it change when you started working with the other musicians?
Sure. Yeah, we started, we started by looking at the compositions together. We took pictures of them and we took them home. I actually started playing them out a little bit, just kind of looking at the form of the piece. Once I looked at it, then I put it inside of a program, Sibelius it's called. There's also another program called Finale. I put it in that program so that it could play it back to me, so I could hear what it was, without me having to play it, but so that I could actually experience it, with the flute on top, his vocal on top, his piano in the bass, as well as the chordal structure of the piece. Once we did that, I started communicating with the musicians, and we started having conversations about tempo and key, and then we started moving things around to suit our performance here. In rehearsal, we then started looking at how do we make it our own? Some of those things, I think Miguel brought a rolling sense to it, as opposed to it being more of a literal translation. Forsyth loved triplets. We still are employing triplets, but we're trying more of a rolling kind of sense to it. Ramona brought some keyboard sense to it, also some electronic things to it. As you see, I'm playing guitar on it. There was no guitar back in those days in this way, so I'm bringing more of an ambient kind of guitar sensibility to it. So we're flipping it, so to speak. Yeah.
And it's also important to note the images you're seeing behind you right now of Flash magazine, which was a pioneering African-American weekly magazine that was published here in Los Angeles. Forsyth actually, when he started to compose less and play less, he started working as a poet and as a journalist.
Absolutely.
And started writing on the pages of Flash.
Yeah, he started, in fact, writing about William Grant Still. I don't know if you know about the African-American composer William Grant Still. He was friends with William Grant Still in New York, and also friends with William Grant Still's future wife, Verna Arvey, a Russian Jew, who was a pianist who actually taught him piano as well. And so, yeah, so they were friends, and I think they had a love triangle, or something happened in 1935 where they stopped communicating. But by that time, Forsyth had been writing about William Grant Still and a number of other composers and luminaries. And I guess his hearing had gone by that time. He became a writer. Well, he was still composing, but he became a writer, a librettist and a writer. Yeah.
So when you're confronted with a legacy like this, and such an important story, and a complicated one, and a heavy one, were there ever moments in approaching the music that you felt, oh, I can't do that, or we shouldn't go that direction, or like what's the line between deference and innovation when you approach a historical text?
Oh, I'm never worthy. I'm always looking at the music like, no, why did I do this? But that's when I know I'm doing the right thing, when I'm scared. And there was a moment when I've been in Ethiopia and Eritrea for the last month, and I took the music with me. And there were moments I couldn't even go near it. Like, it's in my computer. I'm like, I'm not going to touch that file. But yeah, there are, that's the struggle, and that's the wonderful struggle of musicianship. It's kind of pushing our way through that wall.
So we're obviously here. We've been celebrating the past 100 years. And one of the questions that I get a lot from folks is, what's the next 100 years of LA music going to sound like? And it's never a question I like to get, because I never know how to answer it, and I feel that I don't have a good answer. So I thought, what a good thing that I should just ask it to other people. So I wanted to know, actually for all three of you, do you guys have any guesses on what the next 100 years of this small little town is going to sound like? Do you want to start, Dexter? They're looking at you like you must break the silence.
I have a feeling that the lines will be completely blurred between musicians and non-musicians. I think everyone will be a musician at a certain point, and everyone will be able to express. I think Apple's already pushing for that with the iPhone, and I'm sure there's so many apps now where you can create music and not be a musician. Ramona's teaching a course where she's I think you're experiencing that. You want to talk a little bit about what you think? But she was telling us about how there are a lot of non-musicians she's teaching music to, and they're figuring it out, and now...
Well, I mean, non-musician is such a weirdly pejorative term. I mean, we all hear music all around us all the time, and it's just about harnessing the best technology to allow people to express themselves, which I think new technologies are allowing kids to do. And so it's actually a really beautiful thing that more and more people will have that accessibility no matter what their societal position may be.
All right, Miguel, what's LA going to sound like in 100 years?
Diversity.
Oh.
Yeah, in one word, diversity, I think future music is going to be even more diverse.
All right, so in this tradition, we've answered it. In this tradition, we wanted to go back in order to go forward, and you guys are going to close us out with a piece from 1919 that's actually featured in the 1919 exhibition. And it's a title that I always get wrong, so how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? This was the #1 chart-topping most popular song of 1919. And I was like, Dexter, you want to play it?
Yeah, he suggested we play it, and then I started digging and reading about the tune. What an awesome group of collaborators for this. I think Walter Donaldson wrote the music. He also wrote a number of different hits.
This was first a Sophie Tucker hit, and then and then it was
Eddie
recorded
Cantor.
Eddie Cantor, and then recorded by
Fields, yeah.
James Reese Europe.
James Reese Europe performed it in 1919 and died that same year, but actually had recorded it for Pathé. Judy Garland performed it, I think, for Me and My Gals, I think, in that movie. Yeah.
And so it's going to be 1919 like you've never heard it before.
Well, let's see what this sounds like.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Dexter's Story, everybody.
Now that
How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? How you gonna keep them away from Broadway, jazzing around and painting the town? How you gonna keep them away from home? That's a mystery. They'll never wanna see a rake or plow. And who the deuce can parley-vous a cow? How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? Down on the farm after they've seen Perry. How you gonna keep them away from Broadway, jazzing around and painting the town? How you gonna keep them away from home? That's a mystery. Imagine Reuben when he meets his paw. He'll kiss his cheek and holler, ooh la la. How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry?
Dexter Story, Ramona Gonzalez, Miguel Atwood Ferguson. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Huntington. Thank you all. And turn the mic over for some final words.
Thank you, Josh, Dexter, Ramona, and Miguel, and our performers and our panelists. Henry Huntington said the value of our collection will be in what it produces. And I hope that we've all, and I'm sure we all have been moved and interested and inspired by ideas and expressions based on what we have at the Huntington, celebrating all of us. So now what I'd like to do is also thank the team that put this together, 30 Huntington staff who worked together under the direction of Susan Turner Lowe, and I'd like to give everybody, all our panelists, our directors, our performers, a great round of applause and thank you. And now I'd like you to get up from your chairs and join us outside in the Rose Hills Foundation Garden Court, which I think is one of the most beautiful courtyards in the world. Join us for a glass of bubbly and a luncheon reception. And also, please sign the wall-size birthday card on the Maple Orientation Gallery wall. And although we probably won't be here, this card may be on display in the next 100-year celebration. Join us, please, and thank you so much for coming.